The clocks on the battle barge Eternal Crusader synchronized perfectly with the atomic decay of Holy Terra. For the first time in 10,000 years, this was the first sign of the horror. In the 41st millennium, time is a broken thing. Warp travel dilates hours into centuries. Communications arrive before they are sent. The imperial calendar is a lie agreed upon by desperate scribes. But on the third day of the month of prayer, the distortion ended. Every chronometer in the segmentum solar clicked to zero at the exact same moment. Navigators screamed in their blistered sanctums. They did not see the chaotic light of the Astronomicon. They saw a grid. It was cold and blue and perfect. It laid over the warp storms like a cage of iron. The screaming souls of demons fell silent. They were not banished. They were paused. Lord High Admiral Spire looked at his tactical hololith. The Tyranid splinter fleet approaching the agri world of Viridia 4 simply stopped. They did not freeze in ice. They froze in time. A bioship the size of a continent hung motionless in the void. Its tentacles were rigid. The plasma fire from the Imperial defense batteries hung suspended in space like glowing red beads. It was physically impossible. It was technically heresy to witness. The laws of physics had been rewritten by a hand stronger than the Emperor's will. The Admiral ordered the gunnery crews to fire again. The order was relayed by Vox officers who were sweating and trembling. The men pulled the levers. Nothing happened. The firing pins did not strike. The chemical propellant did not ignite. It was as if the concept of combustion had been revoked from the local reality. The silence was worse than the war. For 10,000 years, the Imperium had known only the roar of bolters and the scream of dying worlds. Now there was only a low hum. It came from everywhere and nowhere. It was the sound of a machine vast beyond comprehension coming online. On Mars, the Fabricator General disconnected himself from the noosphere. He had to sever his connection to save his mind. A data packet had infected the sacred archives. It was not scrap code. It was not a demon virus. It was a history book. It contained records of battles that had not happened yet. It listed the death dates of High Lords who were currently alive. It detailed the structural failure of the Golden Throne, down to the microfracture. The logic was flawless. The math was undeniable. The cult Mechanicus is built on the quest for knowledge, but this knowledge was toxic. It proved that their rituals were inefficient. It proved that their prayers were wasted variables. The enemy did not arrive with a fleet. He arrived as a transmission. It bypassed the encryption of the Mechanicus. It ignored the hexwords of the Inquisition. It played on every voxcaster on every deck of every ship in the sector. The voice was calm. It sounded like a human male of middle age. It possessed the tone of a teacher correcting a slow student. It said that the timeline was messy. It said that the chaotic variables of this galaxy were inefficient. It claimed ownership of the future. The voice did not ask for surrender. It asked for compliance with a new schedule. Roboute Guilliman stood in his strategy room on Macragge and watched the data streams. He saw 1,000 years of history rewriting itself on his screens. Battles the Ultramarines had won were changing. The record shifted before his eyes. Casualties were erased. Defeats became victories, and victories became mathematical certainties. A new banner was appearing in the archives where the Aquila used to be. It was a simple geometric shape. It was a mask. The Primarch realized the enemy was not fighting for territory. The enemy was fighting for the right to decide what was true. The Indomitus Crusade had halted not because of supply lines, but because the road ahead no longer existed. It had been edited out. The temporal stasis field over the Segmentum Pacificus dissolved with the sound of cracking glass. It was a noise felt in the teeth rather than heard by the ears. On the bridge of the Imperial Navy battleship Divine Right, Lord Admiral Clytus watched his monitors blink back to life. The red standby lights flickered to green. The hum of the ventilation systems returned. It was a welcome sound. The silence had been heavy and unnatural. Clytus was a man of the old school. He trusted armor plating and macro cannon batteries. He did not trust silence. He gripped the brass railing of the command pulpit. His knuckles were white. He looked at his sensor officers. They were frantically adjusting dials and typing commands into their cogitators. They looked pale. The freeze had lasted for 1 standard hour, but the chronometers on the wall claimed 0 seconds had passed. The Admiral felt a deep ache in his bones. It was the feeling of a body that had aged while the universe stood still. The primary voxcaster crackled. A frantic voice from the planet below spoke. It was Governor Thrax of Hydrofor. The governor was a large man known for his shouting, but now he was whispering. He reported a structure. It was not a ship. It was not an invasion force. It was a tower. It had appeared in the center of the capital city Hive Spire. It had displaced 3 million tons of ferrocrete and 10,000 hab blocks. It had not crashed. It had simply overwritten the space. The people who lived there were gone. There were no bodies. There was no rubble. The space they had occupied was now filled by a smooth blue metal that defied scanning. The Admiral ordered the fleet to high anchor. He ordered weapons batteries to lock onto the surface coordinates. The targeting array spun. The machine spirits of the ship woke up with a growl. They were eager to fire. Down in the lower decks of the Divine Right, a loader named Grigori wiped grease from his forehead. He was tired. His shift had technically ended an hour ago, but the clock said he had just started. His stomach rumbled. The ration bars were tasting worse lately. They were grey and chalky. They tasted like recycled paper. He lifted a heavy shell for the macro cannon. It weighed as much as a man. The hydraulic lift assisted him, but the strain was still there. Grigori did not know about temporal anomalies or alien conquerors. He only knew that the ship was on alert. That meant no sleep. That meant double shifts. That meant the grey paste for dinner again. He looked at the shell. It was painted with a prayer to the Emperor. He hoped the Emperor was watching. He felt very small in the metal belly of the ship. Admiral Clytus gave the order to fire a warning shot. It was a standard procedure. A single lance strike to the side of the unidentified tower. It was meant to show strength. It was meant to demand compliance. The lance battery charged. The air on the bridge tasted of ozone. The beam fired. It was a spear of pure light hot enough to boil an ocean. It travelled down through the atmosphere. It struck the blue metal of the tower. The crew watched the view screen. They expected an explosion. They expected molten debris. Instead, they saw the light bend. The energy of the lance strike hit the surface and flowed around it like water over a stone. The tower absorbed the energy. It glowed brighter for a second. Then it pulsed. A ripple of blue light shot back up the path of the beam. It hit the Divine Right. The shields did not flare. The alarms did not ring. The lights on the bridge simply turned off. Then they turned back on. They were blue. The cogitators reset. The screens cleared. A face appeared on every monitor on the bridge. It was a human face. It was scarred but handsome. The skin was blue, but it looked like a mask or a helmet that fit perfectly. The eyes were human. They were tired eyes. They were the eyes of a man who had seen everything happen 1,000 times. The figure wore armor that looked both ancient and futuristic. It had no aquila. It had no chaos spikes. It had simple lines. The figure spoke. The voice came from the speakers and from the comms beads in every ear. It was calm. It was the voice of a disappointed father. He identified himself as Kang. He did not call himself a god. He did not call himself a demon. He called himself the Conqueror. But he said the word like it was a job title, like he was a gardener here to pull weeds. Kang told the admiral to stand down. He said the Imperial weapons were crude. He said the targeting logic was based on superstitious math. He said the Empire was a mistake. He said he was scrubbing the timeline. Admiral Clytus was a pious man. He drew his service pistol and shot the screen. The glass shattered. The image flickered to the next screen. The Admiral shouted for the comms officer to cut the feed. The officer tried. He pulled cables. He smashed the room keys. The image remained. Kang continued to speak. He listed the Admiral's service record. He listed the battles Clytus had won. Then he listed the tactical errors Clytus had made in the campaign of Aura. Errors that had cost men their lives. Errors Clytus had buried in the reports. Kang knew the casualty counts down to the single digits. He knew the names of the men who had died because Clytus had hesitated. The Admiral froze. The bridge crew looked at him. Their faith was shaking. This enemy did not attack their bodies. He attacked their history. On the surface of Hydrafor, the response was more direct. The Imperial fists were present. The Fifth Company had been refitting at the orbital dock. Captain Demetrius was a veteran of 100 sieges. He did not care about blue lights or speeches. He saw a fortress that was non-imperial. That meant it had to be breached. He mobilized his company. 10 Thunderhawk gunships roared out of the hangars. They descended toward the Hive city. The yellow armor of the Space Marines gleamed in the smoggy light. They were the Emperor's hammer. They did not negotiate. Demetrius checked his bolter. He recited the litany of breaching. His brothers chanted with him over the Vox. They felt the reassuring weight of their power armor. They were walking tanks. They were the pinnacle of human combat evolution. They had never met a wall they could not break. The Thunderhawks approached the tower. The tower had no anti-aircraft guns. It had no void shields. It stood naked against the sky. Demetrius sensed a trap. Space Marines are not naive. They expect ambush. He ordered the pilots to engage evasive patterns. The gunships wove through the spires of the Hive city. They locked missiles onto the base of the tower. Demetrius gave the command. Fire. 40 crack missiles launched. They trailed smoke and fire. They struck the tower. The explosions were massive. Dust and smoke swallowed the target. The Space Marines waited for the dust to clear. They expected to see a hole. They expected to see a breach they could storm. The wind blew the smoke away. The tower was pristine. There was not even a scratch on the blue metal. The missiles had detonated, but the force had been redirected outward. The surrounding HAB blocks were flattened. The innocent civilians in the nearby zones were dust. The tower stood untouched. Demetrius felt a cold spike in his heart. This was not void shielding. This was temporal displacement. The missiles had detonated, but the tower had not been there when they hit. It had shifted a second forward or a second back. It was skipping through time to avoid the blow. Demetrius realized orbital bombardment would be useless. They had to go inside. They had to physically occupy the space. The Thunderhawks landed on a wide plaza near the tower's base. The ram dropped. 50 Space Marines charged. They moved with a speed that belied their bulk. They were a yellow blur of violence. They reached the main gate. There was no door. There was just a field of shimmering energy. Demetrius did not hesitate. He walked through. He expected pain. He expected resistance. He felt nothing. He stepped into a hall that was too big. The geometry was wrong. The ceiling was miles high, but he could see the details of the archways clearly. The floor was polished obsidian. Standing in the hall were soldiers. They were not human. They were not Xenos. They were automatons. They looked like statues made of bronze and glass. Their heads were smooth domes with a single vertical light. They held staffs that crackled with orange energy. The Imperial fists opened fire. Bolter rounds exploded against the bronze chests of the automatons. The metal dented. Some of the machines fell. The Space Marines advanced. They were winning. The enemy was fragile. Demetrius felt a surge of confidence. This was a fight he understood. Metal broke. Enemies died. He signaled for the squad to push forward. He raised his power sword to strike the nearest machine. The machine moved. It did not move fast. It moved instantly. One moment it was in front of him. The next moment it was behind him. Demetrius spun. The machine struck him with the staff. The energy field disrupted his iron halo. It bypassed his ceramite armor. It felt like being hit by a thunderbolt. His muscles seized. He fell to one knee. The battle turned in a second. The automatons were not fighting the Space Marines in the present. They were fighting them in the future. The machines sidestepped bolter rounds before the triggers were pulled. They blocked sword strikes before the arms were raised. It was a slaughter of efficiency. A Space Marine would aim at a head, and the head would already be gone. A brother would throw a grenade, and the machine would catch it and throw it back before the pin had cleared the mechanism. The Imperial fists were disciplined. They fell back to defensive circles. They established overlapping fields of fire. It did not matter. The enemy walked through the fire. They knew where the bullets would be. They walked in the safe spaces between the flight paths of the shells. Demetrius saw his brothers dying. Brother Orton was cut in half by an energy beam. Brother Karas was frozen in a stasis cube. His scream locked on his face. Demetrius roared. He activated his transhuman physiology. He pushed his body beyond the limits. He moved faster than thought. He drove his sword into the chest of a machine. The blade bit deep. Sparks flew. The machine collapsed. Demetrius had killed one. It was possible. But then he looked up. A door at the end of the hall opened. Kang walked out. He was not wearing a helmet. He was floating slightly above the ground on a disc of anti-gravity tech. He looked at the dead machine. He looked at Demetrius. He did not look angry. He looked annoyed. He tapped a device on his wrist. The dead machine on the floor reassembled itself. The sparks flew backward into the chassis. The cut in the metal sealed. The machine stood up. It was whole again. Kang had reversed the damage. He looked at the Space Marines. He spoke. His voice echoed in the vast hall. He told them that their struggle was admirable but mathematically irrelevant. He said that he had played this battle out 1,000,000 times in simulations. In every version, the Space Marines lost. He offered them a choice. They could surrender and become the Praetorian Guard of a new order, or they could be erased, not killed, erased. He would go back to the genetic labs on Terra. He would tamper with the gene seed of Rogel Dawn. He would ensure the Imperial fists were never created. They would cease to exist in memory and history. Demetrius stood up. His armor was smoking. His brothers were battered. He looked at this man who threatened to undo his father's legacy. It was the ultimate blasphemy. Demetrius spat blood on the polished floor. He raised his bolter. He fired a single shot at Kang's head. The bullet flew true. It stopped 1 inch from Kang's forehead. It hung there, spinning. Kang looked at the bullet. He plucked it from the air. He examined the explosive tip. He sighed. He waved his hand. The Imperial fists were blasted backward by a wave of concussive force. They slid across the obsidian floor. They were thrown out of the gate. They landed in the plaza outside. The energy field sealed behind them. They had been evicted. They had been treated like unruly children, not warriors. The humiliation burned worse than the wounds. High above, the Mechanicus enclave on Hydrophor was in a state of religious hysteria. Margos Varnak was the lead datasmith for the sector. He had his mechadendrites plugged into the main cogitator banks. He was reading the energy signatures from the tower. The data was beautiful. It was terrifying. The energy output was perfectly efficient. There was no waste heat. There was no radiation leak. It violated the second law of thermodynamics. It was a perpetual motion of energy. The machine spirit of the cogitator was singing a song of pure binary joy. Varnak felt a temptation he had not felt in 2 centuries. He wanted to touch it. He wanted to understand it. The dogma of the Mechanicus forbade innovation. It forbade the study of Xenos tech. But this was not Xenos tech. It looked human. It looked like the archaeotech of the dark age of technology, but refined to a godlike level. Varnak isolated the signal. He sent a query. It was a simple binary handshake. Identify. The response came back instantly. It was not in binary. It was in High Gothic, but encoded into the data stream. "I'm the architect," the message said. "Your machines are sick. I have the cure." Varnak felt a purge code enter his system. It was aggressive. It attacked the junk code that had accumulated in his bionics over the years. It optimized his logic centers. It cleared the static from his optics. For the first time in decades, Varnak saw clearly. The red haze of his sensors was gone. He saw the world in high definition. The code offered him a schematic. It was a design for a reactor that could power the entire planet with a single gram of hydrogen. It was a gift. It was a trap. To build it would be heresy. To ignore it would be illogical. Varnak stood at the crossroads of faith and reason. His metal fingers twitched. He saved the schematic to a secure drive. He did not report it to the Inquisition. Back on the divine right, the situation was deteriorating. The morale of the crew was cracking. The timeline shifts were becoming more frequent. A gunnery officer screamed and vanished. In his place sat a pile of dust and a rusted uniform. The chronometer on his console showed he had died 300 years ago. A midshipman suddenly remembered a wife and children he did not have 5 minutes ago. He fell to his knees weeping for a family that had been inserted into his memory. The chaplain was walking the deck, shouting litanies of focus. He swung his Crozius, smashing the consoles that showed the anomalies. He demanded the men focus on the Emperor, but the Emperor felt very far away. The Astronomicon was flickering. The guiding light of Terra was being dimmed by the blue grid of Kang's network. Admiral Clytus received a transmission from the High Lords of Terra. The message was fragmented. It had taken weeks to arrive, or maybe seconds. Time was broken. The message was a general distress call. Anomalies were appearing across the galaxy. On Baal, the Blood Angels reported their sanguinary guard turning to dust. On Macragge, the Ultramarines reported their fortress monastery rearranging itself into a prison. The message ordered all fleets to hold position and defend key assets. It was a hold order. It was a sign of fear. Clytus looked at the tower on the screen. It was glowing brighter. It was rooting itself into the reality of the planet. Kang broadcast again. This time, he did not speak to the military. He spoke to the civilians. He spoke to the billions of souls in the Hive City. He told them he knew they were hungry. He knew they were tired. He showed them images of agri-worlds where the crops did not spoil. He showed them manufactorums where the work shift was 6 hours, not 16. He showed them a galaxy where the tithe was calculated by fair math, not by the greed of distant lords. He promised them a future. He called it the Dynasty. The people listened. In the hat blocks, the tired workers looked at the screens. They looked at their grey ration paste. They looked at the blue light of the tower. It looked warm. It looked clean. The seeds of sedition were not sown with hate. They were sown with the promise of a lunch break. The Inquisition representative on the ship, Inquisitor Harrow, stormed onto the bridge. She was a woman of sharp angles and black leather. She demanded the Admiral authorize an exterminatus. She wanted to burn the planet. If the population was listening to the alien, they were tainted. Better to kill billions than let the idea spread. Clytus looked at the button that would release the cyclonic torpedoes. It was a heavy red key. He had used it once before. He remembered the screams over the Vogs. He looked at the tower. He knew the torpedoes would not work. Kang would just shift the planet out of phase. The torpedoes would pass through the world like ghosts. Or worse, Kang would turn the torpedoes into flowers. The Admiral shook his head. He refused the order. Harrow drew her bolt pistol. She aimed it at the Admiral's head. "Heresy," she hissed. "Cowardice." The bridge crew froze. This was the fracture. The Imperium turns on itself when it is afraid. Clytus looked down the barrel of the gun. He was tired. He was so very tired. "Shoot me," he said. "It won't change the timeline." Harrow pulled the trigger. The gun clicked. It did not fire. She pulled it again. Click. She looked at the weapon. The firing mechanism was missing. It was gone. In its place was a small rolled parchment. She pulled it out. It was a note. It was written in elegant handwriting. "No more fratricide. We need every soldier for what comes next." It was signed with a simple K. Harrow screamed in rage. She threw the useless gun at the screen. The presence of Kang was absolute. He controlled the small things, the springs in a gun, the electrons in a wire, the thoughts in a head. The Admiral realized the true horror of the situation. They were not fighting a general. They were fighting an editor. And he had the red pen. Down in the depths of the ship, Grigory the loader sat on his bunk. The alarm was still ringing, but he ignored it. He held a piece of paper he had found in his pocket. He didn't know how it got there. It was a picture. It showed him standing in a field of wheat. The sun was shining. He was smiling. He was holding a child. He did not have a child. He had never seen a wheat field. But the picture felt real. It felt like a memory of a life he was supposed to have. He traced the face of the child with his dirty thumb. He felt a tear cut through the grease on his cheek. He wondered if the blue man in the tower could give him this. He wondered if the Emperor ever promised wheat fields. He folded the picture and put it next to his heart. He stood up and went back to the hoist. The shell had to be loaded, but his loyalty had cracked. It was a hairline fracture invisible to the eye, but fatal to the structure. The tower on Hydrophore pulsed one final time. A wave of blue energy swept over the planet. It did not kill. It reorganized. The chaotic sprawl of the Hive city straightened. The crooked streets aligned into perfect grids. The crumbling Gothic arches smoothed into geometric efficiency. The pollution clouds in the sky dissipated, processed instantly into breathable oxygen and solid waste bricks. The planet was being terraformed in real time. It was being optimized. The Imperium builds cathedrals to suffering. Kang was building a machine for living. The strategic threat was no longer just military. It was existential. If he could fix the broken worlds of the Imperium, who would fight to keep them broken? Admiral Clytus watched the transformation. He saw the efficiency. He hated it. It lacked soul. It lacked the grim grandeur of humanity's struggle. It was too clean. It was a prison disguised as a paradise. He turned to his comms officer. "Send a message to Terra," he said. His voice was steady again. Tell them the war is not for territory. Tell them he is stealing our future. Tell them we are obsolete. The message was sent. It flew through the warp, dodging the storms that Kang was slowly calming. It carried the news of the arrival. The great game of the Chaos Gods had been paused. A new player sat at the table, and he had brought his own dice. The board was set. The Imperium had fired its shot and missed. The Astartes had charged and been swatted aside. The Inquisition had tried to purge and been disarmed. Kang had established his beachhead. He held Hydrophor. He held the key to the Pacificus, and he held the attention of every being in the galaxy. In the darkness of the warp, the 4 Chaos Gods ceased their bickering. They felt the cold order spreading like ice. They felt the timelines straightening. For the first time in eternity, Khorne did not rage. Tzeentch did not scheme. Nurgle did not rot. Slaanesh did not crave. They watched. They waited. They knew that a timeline without chaos was a timeline where they starved. The alliance of hell was forming. But on Hydrophor, the clocks began to tick again. Tick, tock, tick, tock. Perfect rhythm, perfect time. The nightmare of order had begun. The strategic shock of the Hydrophor incident rippled through the higher echelons of the segmentum solar like a physical blow. In the corridors of the Imperial Palace on Terra, the High Lords gathered in a chamber shielded by 10 meters of adamantium and psychic wards of ancient design. They sat in shadows because the light of the sun felt like an intrusion on their grief. The reports were impossible to reconcile with reality. One planet had been reorganized into a perfect grid in less than an hour. One fleet had been rendered inert without a single shot being fired. One company of the Emperor's finest warriors had been treated like children and cast out of their own battlefield. The master of the Administratum tapped a withered finger on a data slate. He noted that the tithes from the Pacificus were not just delayed. They were being recalculated by an external force. The bureaucracy of the Imperium is a glacier that moves over millennia. Kang was a heat lamp placed against the ice. The threat was not just the loss of a world, but the loss of the struggle itself. If the citizens of the Imperium stopped suffering, they might stop praying. If they stopped praying, the light of the Astronomicon would fail. The logic was circular and terrifying. The High Lords decided on a response of absolute force. They did not have the luxury of caution. They ordered the mobilization of the Indomitus Crusade's secondary reserves. They called for the Grey Knights. They called for the Sisters of Silence. They called for everything that could stop the bleeding of time. On the world of Orestes, a different kind of war was beginning. Orestes was a forge world. It was a place of smoke and iron and holy gears. The Mechanicus there did not value life, but they valued the sanctity of the machine. When the blue light touched their vox arrays, they did not scream. They calculated. Archimagos Eruditus was the keeper of the great cog. He saw the data packets from Hydrophor and recognized the signature of a god. Not the Omnissiah, but something close. A being that understood the fundamental architecture of the universe. Eruditus was old. Most of his brain was replaced by copper wiring and crystal memory banks. He remembered the stories of the dark age of technology. He remembered the tales of men who walked between stars without the warp. He felt a hunger that no oil or coolant could satisfy. He wanted the blueprints. He began to secretively divert power from the planetary defense lasers to his private laboratory. He was going to send a signal back. He was going to invite the Conqueror to teach him. He justified it as an acquisition of holy knowledge, but it was the oldest sin of the priesthood. It was innovation. It was the desire to fix what was broken rather than worship the decay. In the void between stars, the Tyranid Hive Fleet Leviathan felt a change in the psychic wind. The shadow in the warp was usually a roar of hunger that drowned out all other signals. Now it was being muffled. The blue grid that Kang had laid over the sector acted as a filter. It began to strip away the psychic static. For the hive mind, this was a tactical complication. The Tyranids rely on the connection between the Norn queens and the swarm. If the connection is slowed, the swarm becomes disorganized. On the moons of Xeros, the Tyranids were currently consuming a garrison of Cardian shock troops. The battle was going according to the biological plan. The defenders were being flanked by Genestealers, while the main swarm took the brunt of the fire. Then the grid pulsed. The Genestealers stopped mid-leap. Their internal clocks were adjusted. They became sluggish, as if the gravity of the moon had doubled. The Cadians did not hesitate. They were men of iron. They saw an opening and took it. They bayoneted the frozen monsters. They called in airstrikes on the huddling swarms. For a moment it looked like a victory. But the Tyranids are the ultimate survivors. Within minutes the hive mind began to adapt. It did not try to break the grid. It tried to vibrate at the same frequency. The monsters began to twitch. Their carapaces changed color to a dull metallic blue. They were evolving to live within the distortion. They were no longer just biological weapons. They were becoming temporal predators. They were learning how to eat the seconds before they were born. Kang sat in the center of his tower on Hydrophor. He was not on a throne. He was at a console. It was a ring of light that hovered around him. He was looking at the timeline of a soldier named Krell. Krell was a sergeant in the 12th Volponi Bluebloods. In the original timeline, Krell would die in 3 hours. He would be stepped on by a Carnifex. His death would inspire his squad to hold a bridge. That bridge would be the key to saving the city. Kang watched the holographic representation of the event. He saw the blood. He saw the heroism. He found it inefficient. He reached out his hand and moved a single icon on the map. He shifted a supply crate 2 inches to the left. That was all. In the real world, Sergeant Krell tripped over the crate as he ran toward the bridge. He fell flat on his face. The Carnifex swung its massive scythe and missed Krell by a hair. Krell crawled under a ruined tank and survived. Because he survived, he did not become a martyr. His squad did not hold the bridge. The bridge fell. The city was lost. But Krell lived to have a son, who would eventually invent a new type of fusion coil that Kang needed for his engine. This was how Kang fought. He did not need to kill an army. He just needed to trip a sergeant. He was a master of the butterfly effect. He was the architect of 1,000,000 small changes that added up to a total conquest of the soul. The warp was in a state of unprecedented agitation. The great game was being disrupted by a wall of logic. Tzeentch, the changer of ways, was the most offended. He thrives on the infinite possibilities of the future. He loves the tangle of lies and the weaving of fates. Kang was straightening the threads. He was turning the labyrinth into a highway. Tzeentch sent a tide of horrors into the sector. They were pink and blue flames that danced and giggled as they tore through reality. They emerged from a rift near the orbital docks of Hydrophor. They expected to find a playground of souls. Instead, they found a vacuum of probability. The grid caught the demons. It analyzed their chaotic makeup. It found the mathematical core of their existence and cancelled it out. A pink horror would try to cast a bolt of change and the grid would force the energy back into a stable state. The fire became lead. The screams became silence. The demons began to pop out of existence like bubbles. They were not being banished to the warp. They were being erased from the equation. This was a new kind of death for a demon. It was a death without the hope of return. The Chaos Gods realized that if Kang succeeded, the warp would be sealed forever behind a wall of perfect math. They would be trapped in the basement of the universe with nothing to eat but the memories of a chaotic past. It was the fleet of High Admiral Dozeman. He brought 3 Retribution-class battleships and a dozen cruisers. He also brought a black ship of the Inquisition. On board that ship was an untouchable, a man whose very presence was a hole in reality. His name was Iota. He was used to kill psychers and banish demons. The Inquisition believed that if Kang was a temporal entity, he might be vulnerable to the blankness of an untouchable. They deployed Iota in a specialized boarding pod. They fired it directly at the tower. The pod punched through the blue metal. It did not melt. It did not phase. The presence of the untouchable created a pocket of dead space where Kang's technology could not function. Iota stepped out of the pod. He carried a heavy needle pistol. He was cold. He was empty. He walked through the halls of the tower. The automatons did not move. Their temporal sensors could not lock onto him. He was a ghost in their machine. Iota reached the central chamber. He saw Kang at the console. He did not hesitate. He raised his pistol and fired. The needle was made of a substance that disrupted psychic and temporal fields. It flew toward Kang's neck. Kang did not look up. He did not move. The needle hit him. It passed through his skin. It passed through his bone. It came out the other side and stuck in the wall. There was no blood. There was no wound. Kang turned around slowly. He looked at the untouchable with a look of genuine curiosity. He told Iota that he was a fascinating biological anomaly. He explained that Iota's power worked by negating the soul's connection to the warp. But Kang was not using the warp. He was using the fundamental laws of time and space. He told Iota that a hole in the water is still part of the ocean. Then Kang did something terrible. He accelerated the time around the Iota's body. In the span of 5 seconds, the untouchable aged 80 years. His skin wrinkled, his bones turned to dust. His heart slowed and stopped. The man who was a void in the warp became a pile of grey ash on the obsidian floor. Kang sighed. He called a cleaning drone to sweep up the remains. The Inquisition's secret weapon had been defeated by a simple fast-forward button. High Admiral Dozeman saw the failure on his monitors. He saw the life signs of the untouchable vanish. He grew desperate. He ordered a coordinated macro-cannon barrage on the tower's base. Thousands of shells the size of houses fell from the sky. They were filled with high explosives and holy incense. They hit the plaza. The ground shook. The Hive city trembled. Thousands of civilians were killed by the shockwaves. The Admiral did not care. He was a servant of the Golden Throne. Collateral damage was a statistic, but as the smoke cleared, he saw the horror. The shells had hit, but they had not exploded. They were sitting on the ground in a perfect circle around the tower. They were rusted. They looked like they had been sitting there for 1,000 years. Kang had aged the metal of the shells to the point of failure before they could detonate. The explosive filler had turned to inert dust. The holy incense had rotted. The Admiral realized his weapons were useless against a man who could turn his ammunition into relics of forgotten age. The desperation of the Imperium began to manifest in darker ways. On the world of Katachan, the jungle was dying. The blue grid was stabilizing the weather. The deadly spores were being neutralized. The carnivorous plants were being pruned by drones. For the Katachan jungle fighters, this was a nightmare. Their entire culture was based on surviving the most hostile environment in the galaxy. If the jungle became a park, they would lose their identity. Colonel Strachan looked at the blue drones hovering over the trees. He saw them spraying a chemical that turned the poisonous vines into harmless ivy. He felt a rage that he usually reserved for orcs. He grabbed his combat knife. He led a squad of his best men into the woods. They did not attack the drones with guns. They used traps. They used vines and pits. They used the old ways. They managed to bring down one of the drones. They tore it apart with their bare hands. Inside they found no gears. They found no oil. They found a core of light that hummed with a low frequency. Straken touched the light. He saw a vision. He saw a version of Katakan, where his men did not have to die at the age of 20. He saw a world where children could play in the grass. He saw a life without the constant fear of being eaten. He pulled his hand away, as if burned. It was a temptation. It was a lie. He smashed the core with his bionic fist. He told his men that the blue man was trying to steal their strength. He said that a man who does not struggle is a man who is already dead. But in the eyes of his younger soldiers, he saw a flicker of doubt. They were tired of the jungle. They were tired of the death. The seeds of the dynasty were growing even in the most loyal hearts. The Mechanicus on Orestes finally made contact. Archmagos Eruditus sent a burst of binary code into the grid. It was a poem. It was a mathematical proof of the beauty of the machine. Kang responded. He did not send code. He sent a physical object. It appeared on the Archmagos' workbench in a flash of blue light. It was a small cube of shifting metal. It was a tesseract. Inside the cube was a tiny piece of a dying star. It provided enough energy to power a continent for 1 billion years. Along with the gift was a message. Kang invited the Archmagos to help him build the Chronopolis. He said that the Imperium treated technology like a religion because they were afraid of it. He said that he treated technology like a tool because he mastered it. Eruditus looked at the cube. He looked at the red-robed priests who were chanting litanies to a broken engine in the next room. He made his choice. He declared the sector of Orestes independent from the Imperium. He declared his loyalty to the Conqueror. He was the first high-ranking official to defect. It was a strategic disaster. Orestes was a major producer of Lehman Russ tanks and laser guns. The supply lines for 3 war zones were severed in a single night. The High Lords of Terra reacted with predictable brutality. They declared Orestes a traitor world. They ordered a nearby fleet of the Iron Hand Space Marines to eliminate the Archmagos. The Iron Hands are the most cold and logical of the Astartes. They hate weakness. They hate the flesh. They saw the Archmagos' defection as a failure of logic. They descended upon Orestes with the fury of a storm. Their drop pods slammed into the industrial zones. They emerged with bolters barking. They expected to find a disorganized mob of tech priests. Instead, they found the automatons. Kang had reinforced his new ally. The battle was a clash of 2 types of machine logic. The Iron Hands fought with iron will and heavy armor. The automatons fought with the precision of a clock. Every time an Iron Hand raised his shield, an automaton was already firing at the gap in the plate. Every time a dreadnought swung its power claw, the automaton stepped into the blind spot. The Iron Hands were being outcalculated. The chapter master of the Iron Hands, Gardan Stronos, joined the fray. He was more machine than man. His logic circuits were screaming. He could not understand how the enemy was predicting his movements. He engaged a group of the bronze machines. He moved with a speed that was calculated to be optimal. He used his lightning claws to shred the metal of the nearest automaton. But the metal flowed back together. The temporal restoration was constant. Stronos realized he was fighting a losing battle against time itself. He ordered a tactical retreat. It was the first time in the chapter's history they had retreated from a purely technological foe. As they pulled back to their Thunderhawks, Stronos saw the Archmagos standing on a balcony. Eruditus was no longer wearing his red robes. He was wearing a cloak of blue light. He looked younger. His metal parts were no longer rusted. They were polished and sleek. He looked down at the Space Marines and sent a final binary burst. The flesh is weak. The machine is flawed. But the timeline is perfect. The strategic chain reaction was now unstoppable. With the loss of Orestes, the Imperium's ability to wage war in the sector was crippled. The Tyranids were evolving into something even the Inquisition could not name. The Chaos Gods were forming an unholy pact to break the grid, and on 1,000 worlds the common people were beginning to pray to the man in the blue mask. They were not praying for salvation from sin. They were praying for a better life. They were praying for the end of the long war. Kang was winning because he was providing the one thing the Emperor could not give his people. A reason to live for tomorrow instead of a reason to die for today. Kang decided to move his tower. He did not fly it through space. He moved it through the calendar. The tower vanished from Hydrophor. It appeared 3 minutes later on the surface of Armageddon. Armageddon was a world of eternal war. It was the place where the Orcs and the Imperium had been locked in a stalemate for decades. Gaz-Kulmag Uruk-Thraka, the prophet of the War, was there. He was the largest Orc in the galaxy. He lived for the fight. When the blue tower appeared in the middle of his camp, he was delighted. He thought it was a new toy to break. He gathered his knobs and charged. Millions of Orcs followed him, screaming their war cry. It was a green tide of muscle and scrap metal. They hit the blue energy field around the tower like a wave against a cliff. Kang walked out of the tower. He did not bring his automatons. He walked alone. He looked at the massive Orc war boss. Gazkul was 4 times his size. The Orc swung his massive power claw. It was a weapon that could crush a tank. Kang did not dodge. He reached out and touched the claw. He did not use force. He used a localized time loop. The Orc's arm was caught in a repetitive cycle. The claw moved forward an inch, then jumped back an inch. It happened 1,000 times a second. To the Orc, it felt like his arm was vibrating into jelly. Gazkul roared in frustration. He tried to swing with his other hand. Kang touched his leg. The leg fell into a different time stream. It aged 1,000 years and turned to stone. The great Orc fell. He was not defeated by strength. He was defeated by the fact that his body no longer existed in the same moment. The Orcs stopped. They were a simple race. They respected power. They saw a small man in a blue mask break their greatest leader without breaking a sweat. It was the most un-Orky thing they'd ever seen. It was so confusing it broke their collective psychic field. The Wa energy dissipated. The Orcs began to look at each other. They looked at the blue tower. It was shiny. It was big. They didn't want to fight it. They wanted to see what it did. Kang spoke to them in a language of pure aggression that their small brains could understand. He told them he had a better fight for them. He pointed toward the Great Rift. He pointed toward the realms of chaos. He told them that there were infinite enemies in the warp, that they could fight forever. He offered to send them there. He offered them the ultimate war. The Orcs cheered. They didn't care about the timeline. They just wanted to hit things. Kang opened a massive portal. He did not use the warp. He used a bridge across dimensions. Millions of Orcs marched into the rift. They were launched like a green spear into the eye of Terra. Kang had just weaponized the Orcs against the Chaos Gods. He had cleared Armageddon of its greatest threat and used it to attack his greatest rivals. It was a masterstroke of strategic efficiency. The Imperium watched from their orbital stations. They saw the Orcs vanish. They saw the war that had consumed billions of lives end in an afternoon. They should have been happy. They should have celebrated. But they were terrified. Armageddon was a cornerstone of Imperial propaganda. It was the symbol of their resilience. If the war was over, the propaganda was dead. The soldiers on the ground did not know what to do. They stood in their trenches with their guns pointed at an empty horizon. The silence was deafening. A young lieutenant named Harkin looked at the blue tower. He looked at his ragged uniform and his empty stomach. He took off his helmet. He started walking toward the tower. One by one, his men followed him. They were not surrendering to an enemy. They were walking toward a future that made sense. The Inquisition saw this and panicked. Inquisitor Harrow, who had survived the confrontation on the Divine Right, was now in command of a hidden bunker on Armageddon. She saw the soldiers defecting. She saw the peace spreading. She knew the Imperium could not survive peace. The Imperium is a war machine. If it stops, it falls apart. She activated a failsafe. Deep beneath the surface of Armageddon were ancient bombs from the time of the Horus Heresy. They were designed to destroy the planet if it ever fell to the enemy. She turned the keys. She did not care about the millions of loyal soldiers still on the surface. She did not care about the history of the world. She wanted to deny Kang his prize. She wanted to prove that the Imperium's hate was stronger than his order. The bombs armed, the timers reached zero. But there was no explosion. Deep in the crust of the planet, the atoms of the explosives were being held in place by blue filaments of light. Kang had known about the bombs since the moment he arrived. He had mapped every inch of the planet's history. He knew the location of every wire and every fuse. He did not let them fire. He did not let the fire happen. He sent a message to Harrow's bunker. It was a single line of text on her screen. "Your hate is a waste of energy. I can use that heat for better things." The bunker's life support systems reversed. The oxygen was pumped out and replaced with a mild sedative. Harrow fell asleep, dreaming of a fire that would never burn. The galaxy was in a state of total upheaval. The traditional lines of conflict were gone. The Necrons were starting to wake up in greater numbers. Their ancient sensors were detecting a rival for the title of Masters of Time. Sareth the Silent King looked out from his throne on the final command. He saw the blue grid. He saw the way Kang manipulated the Chronos. He recognized the technology. It was not Necron, but it operated on the same principles of deterministic physics. The Silent King felt a rare emotion. It was respect mingled with extreme territoriality. The Necrons had slept for 60 million years to inherit the galaxy. They would not let a human in a blue mask take it from them in a weekend. The dynasties began to mobilize. They did not care about the Imperium. They did not care about chaos. They were moving to challenge the Conqueror for the throne of time itself. The human cost of these events was beginning to show. On 1,000 worlds the weather was perfect, but the people were becoming hollow. There was no more art. There was no more music of struggle. There was only the hum of the grid. A woman named Elara on the world of Vigilus looked at the sky. It was a beautiful blue. The food dispensers provided nutritious, if tasteless, meals every day. Her house was warm. Her clothes were clean. But she missed the sound of the wind. She missed the unpredictability of a storm. She felt like a bird in a gilded cage. She saw a group of Kang's automatons walking down the street. They were efficient. They were polite. They were terrifying. She realized that Kang had not saved them. He had just put them in a museum. They were part of his collection now. They were specimens of a human race that he had curated and tamed. She looked at a sharp piece of metal she had hidden under her bed. She wondered if she had the courage to cut the grid. She wondered if she preferred the cold and the hunger to the perfect silence of the Conqueror. The strategic situation was a powder keg. The Imperium was broken. The Mechanicus was divided. The Tyranids were adapting. The orcs were being used as a distraction. The Chaos Gods were desperate. The Necrons were waking up. And in the center of it all, Kang sat at his console. He was not finished. He had only just started the first chapter of his new history. He looked at the date on his screen. It was the year 42,000. He smiled. He liked the look of it. He began to type the next command. He was going to delete the concept of the warp. He was going to turn the galaxy into a clock, and he was the only one who had the key to wind it. This ends with a pulse of blue light that was seen from every corner of the universe. It was the sound of 1 billion hearts beating in unison. It was the sound of the end of the world. The strategic collapse of the Segmentum Solar began not with a bombardment but with a correction of the ledger. On the world of Cypra Mundi, the primary logistics hubs for the Imperial Navy simply ceased to function because the concept of debt had been removed from the local data stacks. The Imperial Tithe was based on the extraction of life and material through a process of historical obligation. Kang the Conqueror replaced this with a system of absolute resource allocation. In the span of a single solar week, the complex bureaucracy of the sector was rendered redundant. The clerks who had spent generations tracking the movements of grain and promethium found their desks empty. Their ledgers were filled with blue light that reorganized the numbers into a perfect zero. This was the first stage of the Conqueror's campaign. He was not just taking worlds. He was dismantling the infrastructure of the human soul. The Imperium is built on the belief that the past dictates the future. Kang was proving that the past could be edited with a keystroke. The High Lords of Terra issued a decree for a total mobilization of the Sol System defenses. They knew that if the logic of the grid reached the throne room, the Emperor's authority would vanish. The first major military engagement of this phase occurred in the asteroid belts of the Cadian Gate. The remnants of the Cadian High Command had established a secondary defense line to contain the leaking of the warp after the fall of their home world. They were prepared for demons. They were prepared for the Black Legion. They were not prepared for a man who could turn their ammunition back into raw ore. Admiral Darmitage commanded a fleet of 60 vessels. He ordered a broadside against a fleet of blue-hulled frigates that had appeared without jumping from the warp. The macro cannons fired. The shells travelled across the void in a perfect line. Halfway to the target, the shells hit an invisible barrier. To the observers on the bridge, it looked like the shells were being unmade. The metal hulls peeled away. The chemical explosives separated into their base elements. The shells did not explode. They became clouds of iron dust and nitrogen gas. The blue frigates did not return fire. They simply moved through the debris. They were moving at speeds that ignored the laws of inertia. On the planet of Mars, the schism within the cult Mechanicus turned into a civil war. Archimagos Eruditus had sent the blueprints of the Tesseract to his followers within the Red World. The Fabricator General declared the technology an abominable intelligence. He ordered the purging of the Erudition subsex. The streets of the Forge World ran with sacred oils and blood. Skitari legions clashed in the canyons of the Noctis Labyrinth. The traditionalists used ancient heavy weaponry and radiation projectors. The Eruditians used weapons that looked like glass rods. When these rods were fired, they did not emit heat or kinetic force. They emitted a frequency that caused the targets to fall out of sync with the current second. A Skitari soldier would find his legs moving 5 seconds faster than his torso. A tank would find its engine rotating in the past, while its tracks were in the future. The physical structure of the machines could not handle the temporal shear. The loyalist forces were being literally torn apart by the difference between then and now. Kang did not ignore the Necrons. He knew that the silent dynasties were the only ones who truly understood the nature of the weapon he was using. He decided to strike first. He targeted the crown world of the Saltec dynasty. Imhotep the Stormlord was preparing a counter-offensive when his throne room was breached. There was no alarm. There was no teleportation flash. A door simply appeared in the wall where a wall had been for millions of years. Kang walked through. He was flanked by his bronze automatons. Imhotep stood up. His metal body was a masterpiece of ancient science. He raised his staff of destroyer. He prepared to use his legendary tactical mind to predict Kang's movements. But as Imhotep analyzed the situation, his logic circuits hit a recursive loop. Kang was not a single entity. He was a multi-temporal presence. To Imhotep's sensors, Kang was standing in the room, had already left the room, and had not yet arrived. The Necron's mind could not calculate a strategy against a target that existed in a state of chronological superposition. Kang spoke to the Stormlord. He did not use the high-flown language of the Necron tier. He spoke with the bluntness of a conqueror who had already won. He told Imhotep that the Necrons had failed because they were static. They had slept for millions of years waiting for a universe that had passed them by. Kang claimed that he was the evolution of their science. He offered the Stormlord a position as a regional governor in the new timeline. Imhotep responded with a blast of emerald lightning. The energy hit Kang's chest and passed through him. It hit the wall behind him and melted the necrodermis. Kang did not even flinch. He walked up to the Stormlord and placed a hand on his shoulder. He did not use a weapon. He simply accessed the command protocols of the Saltec dynasty. These protocols were billions of years old. They were hard-coded into the core of every Necron. Kang had spent a subjective century in the future studying the source code of the Necron race. He entered an override command. Imhotep, the Stormlord, the greatest tactical mind of his age, fell to his knees. His eyes flickered and turned blue. The entire Saltec dynasty, billions of immortal warriors, was now under the direct control of the Conqueror. This was a strategic reversal of such magnitude that it was felt by the Khitan shards in their prisons. The loss of the Saltec was the signal for the Tyranid hive mind to escalate its adaptation. On the world of Tarsis Ultra, the swarm was being held back by a combined force of ultramarines and planetary militia. The blue grid was suppressing the synapse signals. The Norn Queen in orbit realized that psychic communication was too vulnerable to Kang's interference. It began to evolve a new form of biological transmission. It created a breed of creature that did not think. It acted as a living clock. These creatures, called Chronovores by the fleeing survivors, emitted a field that countered the grid. They did not fix time. They made it messy again. Within the field of a Chronovore, the laws of probability became volatile. A bolter might fire 1,000 rounds in a second, or it might take 1,000 years to cycle the bolt. The Tyranids used this chaos to breach the Imperial lines. They moved in staccato bursts of speed that the automated turrets could not track. The Ultramarines, led by Captain Uriel Ventris, fought with desperate discipline. They realized that the Tyranids were no longer just eating biomass. They were eating the Conqueror's order. The swarm was becoming a weapon of pure entropy. The strategic chain reaction continued as the Grey Knights arrived in the sector. Grand Master Varden Kai led 3 brotherhoods to the tower on Hydrafur. They did not come to fight with steel. They came to fight with the soul. They believed that Kang's power was a form of sorcery, no matter how much it looked like science. They formed a psychic circle in the ruins of the Hive City. They began to chant the litanies of banishment. The air grew cold. The warp began to bleed into the material world, drawn by their collective will. They were trying to summon a storm that would drown the grid. It was a dangerous gamble. They were risking the corruption of the planet to destroy the Conqueror. Kang watched them from his screens. He did not look worried. He looked intrigued. He had never seen human psychic potential used with such focus. He decided to test the limits of their faith. Kang did not attack the Grey Knights. He simply showed them the truth of their creation. He projected a holographic record of the Horus heresy into their minds. But it was not the record they knew. It was the unedited version. He showed them the Emperor not as a god, but as a man who had made 1,000 mistakes. He showed them the origins of the Grey Knights as a desperate plan hatched in the shadow of failure. He showed them the futures where the Imperium fell, regardless of their sacrifice. For the Grey Knights, whose power is built on absolute certainty, this was the ultimate poison. One by one, their psychic shields flickered. The chanting became ragged. A Grand Master is a mountain of willpower, but even a mountain can be eroded by the weight of eternity. Kang then offered them a new purpose. He showed them a galaxy without demons. He showed them a world where their vigil was finally over. He offered them peace. To a warrior who has known only war for 1,000 years, peace is a terrifying temptation. Varden Kai held the line, but half of his brothers fell silent. Their spirits were not broken by hate, but by the exhaustion of a 10,000-year war that they were now told was a mistake. The moral fracture of the Imperium was spreading to the highest levels. In the Imperial Palace on Terra, the High Lords were arguing. Some wanted to use the Terminus Decree. Others wanted to surrender to Kang to save humanity from the Tyranids and chaos. The Master of the Astronomicon reported that the beacon was dying, not because of the warp, but because the light was being redirected. Kang was using the Astronomicon as a power source for his grid. He was literally stealing the Emperor's fire to cook his dinner. The Custodian Guard, the elite protectors of the Emperor, took control of the chamber. They did not care about politics. They cared only about the safety of the Golden Throne. They began to prepare for the final defense. They knew that Kang was coming for the source. He wanted the Emperor not as a ruler, but as a battery. A small choice led to a massive outcome on the world of Vrax. A lone scribe named Elitus was tasked with recording the casualties of the current uprising. He found a discrepancy in the numbers. According to the grid, the war on Vrax had ended 10 years ago. But he could still hear the guns. He could still smell the chemical gas. He realized that Kang was running two versions of reality simultaneously. One was the official version for the archives, and the other was the messy reality of the war. Kang was using the war on Vrax to train his automatons. He was using the suffering of millions as a simulation. Elitus decided to broadcast this discovery. He used an old Vox array that had been overlooked by the grid. The message reached the ears of the common soldiers. They realized they were being used as training dummies for an alien conqueror. The rebellion on Vrax stopped being a civil war and became a unified revolt against the Blue Mask. This was the first time that ordinary humans had broken the Conqueror's narrative through their own agency. It was a tiny spark, but it proved that the human spirit was not as easy to edit as the data stacks. The strategic situation took a sharp turn when the Chaos Gods launched their counterattack. They did not send an army. They sent a wound. Abaddon, the Despoiler, leading the Black Legion, struck at the heart of the grid's power nodes. He used the Drachnian, the sword that is the end of empires. The blade was not a physical weapon. It was an echo of the first murder. It was a piece of pure chaos that could not be calculated. When Abaddon struck a blue pylon on the world of Kasar Kin, the grid did not absorb the blow. It shattered. The wound in reality bled warp energy that was so dark it turned the blue light into black sludge. For the first time, Kang's face showed a flicker of concern. He had accounted for the gods. But he had underestimated the power of human malice combined with demonic essence. The Black Legion began to pour through the breach. They were not fighting for victory. They were fighting for the right to be chaotic. They began to mutate the automatons, turning the perfect bronze machines into screaming piles of flesh and metal. Kang responded by deploying the Sautek Necrons. The void around Kasrkin became a graveyard of ships. The Necron Gauss flayers tore through the hulls of the Chaos cruisers. The Black Legion responded with sorcery and sacrifice. It was a war of three distinct logics: the perfect order of Kang, the cold precision of the Necrons, and the screaming entropy of chaos. In the middle of this, the Imperial Navy tried to maintain a blockade. Admiral Spire, who had survived the first contact, found himself in a position where he had to choose who to fire upon. If he hit the Chaos ships, he was helping Kang. If he hit the Necrons, he was letting the demons in. He chose to fire on everyone. He declared a zone of total denial. It was a doctrinal overreaction that cost him his entire fleet, but it stalled the conflict. It was a moment of imperial purity. If the galaxy could not be the Emperor's, then it would be no one's. The human cost continued to rise as the weather-controlled worlds began to suffer from the conflict. On Hydrafor, the perfect grids were being broken by the fallout of the orbital battles. The food dispensers were failing. The people who had grown accustomed to the Conqueror's care were now helpless. They had forgotten how to scavenge. They had forgotten how to hunt. They sat in their clean apartments and starved. A man named Hector, who had been a loyal worker in the new regime, looked at his daughter. She was crying because there was no more synthetic bread. Hector realized that Kang's peace was a fragile thing. It was a system that worked only as long as everyone complied. The moment there was friction, the system broke. Hector took a rusted pipe and walked out into the street. He wasn't going to fight for the Emperor or for chaos. He was going to fight for his right to be a desperate animal again. He joined a mob of thousands who were marching toward the Blue Tower. They didn't have guns. They had rocks and anger. The automatons fired into the crowd, killing hundreds in seconds. But the crowd did not stop. They were no longer afraid of the future. They were only afraid of the present. Kang watched the mob from his high balcony. He saw the bodies piling up. He saw the blood staining his perfect obsidian floors. He felt a sense of disappointment. He had given them everything. He had given them safety, health, and a future, and they were throwing it away for a chance to scream in the mud. He realized that the human race was a flaw in the timeline. They were a variable that could not be balanced. He began to think about a galaxy without them. He looked at the Necrons. They were much easier to manage. They followed orders. They didn't have feelings. He began to draft a new plan. He would use the humans to fight the Chaos Gods and the Tyranids. Once the enemies were gone, he would phase out the human race entirely. He would replace them with a more stable biological substrate. This was the moment where Kang stopped being a gardener and became an exterminator. He was no longer trying to fix the Imperium. He was trying to replace it. The strategic revelation was the discovery of the Chronopolis. It was not a city on a planet. It was a city made of moments. Kang had built a fortress that existed in the cracks between seconds. It was here that he stored the captured heroes of the past and future. Inside the Chronopolis were Primarchs who had been snatched from their time. Sanguinius was there, frozen in the moment before his death. Ferrus Manus was there, his head still attached to his shoulders. Kang was collecting the best pieces of the Imperium like a boy collecting lead soldiers. He was keeping them in reserve. If he ever needed a champion, he would simply brainwash one of these icons and send them into battle. This was the ultimate blasphemy. He was not just stealing the future. He was looting the graveyard of the past. This concluded with a massive shift in the warp. The four Chaos Gods, sensing their imminent starvation, did something that they had not done since the birth of Slaanesh. They merged their essences into a single entity of pure negation. They created the Great Unmaker. It was a storm of such power that it began to dissolve the blue grid from the outside in. The grid began to vibrate and hum. On every world, the people looked up and saw the sky turning the color of a bruised soul. The hum of the grid was being drowned out by a laughter that was billions of years old. Kang stood in his tower and felt the floor shake. The timeline was no longer straight. It was beginning to curl like a burning piece of paper. He realized that he could not win by math alone. He needed a hero. He looked at the stasis chamber where he kept the captured Primarchs. He reached for the controls. He was going to release the lion. He was going to give the Imperium back its sun, but only if the sun agreed to wear the blue mask. The offer was being prepared. The convergence was near. This ended with the sound of 1,000 bells tolling for a galaxy that was being pulled apart by two different types of madness. The strategic condition of the galaxy shifted from a conflict of occupation to a war of total ontological erasure. Kang the Conqueror no longer viewed the human race as a resource to be managed, but as a systemic error that required a factory reset. On the orbital shipyards of Sipramundi, the manufacturing of Imperial vessels stopped entirely. The blue grid had fully integrated with the dry dock cogitators, and the new ships emerging from the berths were no longer made of steel and rivets. They were sleek vessels of translucent crystal that lacked crew quarters. They were piloted by the synchronized consciousness of the Chronopolis. These ships did not move through the warp. They moved through the probability of space. They did not fire shells. They fired events. A single strike from a Chronopolis frigate would cause a target ship to experience 10,000 years of metal fatigue in a single nanosecond. Imperial cruisers simply crumbled into dust as their hulls reached the end of their lifespan before they could fire a single macro cannon. Kang stood within the central spire of the Chronopolis, which had now physically manifested above the ruins of the Imperial Palace on Terra. The sky of the throne world was no longer black with the smog of industry. It was a terrifyingly clear violet. Below the spire, the custodian guards stood in a silent circle around the inner sanctum. They were the last defenders of the old timeline. Trajan Valoris, the captain general, held the Watcher's axe with a grip that could crush stone. He watched the blue machines drifting over the battlements of the palace. These machines were not attacking. They were scanning. They were cataloguing every gene strand and every recorded memory of the Emperor's household. Kang was not looking for a fight. He was looking for the source code of the human species. He had determined that the only way to stabilize the timeline was to go back to the beginning of the Unification Wars and prevent the Emperor from ever taking the throne. The strategic chain reaction was accelerated by the arrival of the Lion. L. Johnson, the Primarch of the First Legion, had been released from his stasis chamber within the Chronopolis. Kang had not used mind control. He had used logic. He showed the Lion the state of the Imperium in the 41st millennium. He showed him the rotting bureaucracy, the religious hysteria, and the endless suffering. Then he showed the Lion the alternative. He showed him a galaxy of order and peace where no human had to fear the dark. The Lion was a creature of duty and secrets. He looked at the blue mask of the Conqueror and saw a mirror of his own pragmatic soul. He agreed to lead the new vanguard, not because he loved Kang, but because he hated the failure of the world his father had built. The first mission of the Lion was to go to the Rock, the mobile fortress of the Dark Angels, and demand the surrender of his sons. The arrival of a Primarch at the Rock was an event that broke the spirit of the chapter. The Dark Angels are built on secrets and shame. When their father returned from the dead wearing the livery of the blue grid, they did not know how to react. Supreme Grandmaster Azrael stood on the bridge of the rock and looked at the screen. He saw the lion standing beside the bronze automatons of Kang. The lion told his sons that the hunt for the fallen was over. He told them that history had been corrected and their sins were erased. He ordered them to stand down and integrate their fleet into the Chronopolis network. For Azrael, this was a moral fracture that could not be healed. To obey was to survive, but to obey was also to admit that 10,000 years of penance were a lie. He chose to resist. He ordered the rock to fire on the Primarch. The shot was never fired. The bridge of the rock was instantly transported 10 seconds into the future, while the gun batteries remained in the present. The ship tore itself apart as its own timeline became desynchronized. The lion watched as the fortress of his sons dissolved into a cloud of debris. He did not weep. He simply noted the inefficiency of their loyalty. On the world of Roboute, Guilliman felt the loss of the rock like a physical wound. He was the Lord Regent of the Imperium, and he was a man of systems. He saw that Kang was winning because he was replacing the Imperial system with a superior one. Guilliman gathered the remaining leaders of the Ultramarines and the representatives of the High Lords. He told them that the Imperium could not win a war of technology. They had to win a war of meaning. He proposed a strategic reversal. If Kang was a being of pure logic, they would meet him with pure faith. This was a bitter pill for Guilliman, who had always been a man of reason. But he saw that only the irrational could survive a world governed by a man who could calculate the future. He ordered the ecclesiarchy to initiate a great pilgrimage. He wanted billions of souls to converge on Terra. He wanted to clog the gears of Kang's grid with the sheer mass of human belief. The human cost of this decision was staggering. Billions of citizens left their homes on agri-worlds and hive worlds. They packed into overloaded transport ships. They had no food and no water. They traveled toward the Segmentum Solar, fueled by nothing but the desperate hope that the Emperor would save them. Many died in the cold of space. Their bodies were ejected from airlocks, creating a trail of frozen corpses that stretched across light years. This was the weathering of the human spirit. The people were no longer individuals. They were a tide of flesh. Kang watched the pilgrimage from his spire. He saw the ships approaching. He saw the chaos they brought. He realized that Guilliman was trying to drown the grid in variables. 1 billion humans praying for a miracle created a psychic noise that interfered with the temporal sensors of the automatons. The machines could not predict the movements of a mob driven by religious frenzy. The Necrons of the Celtic Dynasty, now under Kang's control, were deployed to intercept the pilgrimage. The silent warriors of the Necron Tyre moved through the transport ships like harvesters through wheat. They did not use guns. They used molecular disassemblers. They walked through the crowded halls of the ships, and the people simply evaporated. There was no blood. There was no screaming. There was only the sound of 1 billion voices suddenly silenced. But for every ship the Necrons destroyed, 10 more arrived. The sheer scale of the Imperium's population was its only remaining weapon. The high bureaucracy of Terra, which had always been a burden, was now an asset. The inefficiency of the Imperium meant that Kang could not find a single point of failure to exploit. He had to kill everyone one by one. Inside the Mechanicus, the schism had reached its peak. The Loyalists on Mars were led by a tech priest named Khal. He had spent 10,000 years innovating in secret, and now he revealed his final work. He had created a device called the Pharos Resonance. It was a machine that used ancient Xenos technology to broadcast a signal that was anchored in the absolute present. It created a zone where time could not be manipulated. Cole activated the device on Mars. A wave of white light swept across the planet. The temporal distortions of the eruditions vanished. The automatons within the zone became static statues. For the first time, Kang's influence was pushed back. But the cost was the destruction of the Martian atmosphere. The white light stripped the air from the planet. The tech priests who were not fully mechanized died instantly. The survivors lived in a vacuum of their own making. Carl looked at the data and saw that the zone was stable, but it was shrinking. The grid was pushing back. The strategic complication was the arrival of the Tyranid Chronovores. These creatures had finished their evolution. They were no longer beasts. They were living paradoxes. They arrived at Terra not as a swarm but as a rift in the sky. They began to eat the violet light of the Chronopolis. They were consuming the energy of the timeline itself. Kang realized that the Tyranids were the ultimate entropy. If they were allowed to eat the grid, they would not just destroy his empire, they would destroy the concept of time. The universe would become a static moment of eternal hunger. Kang had to divert half of his bronze army to fight the swarm in the clouds of Terra. The battle was a nightmare of shifting shapes. A Tyranid would be killed and then reappear a second later. An automaton would be crushed and then restore itself. The sky was a kaleidoscope of violence where death was a temporary state. Amidst this chaos, a small group of humans led by the loader Grigory reached the base of the Chronopolis spire. Grigory had been a prisoner on a transport ship that had crashed in the ruins of the Imperial Palace. He was a man of no importance. He was dirty and hungry and tired. But he held the picture of the wheat field in his hand. He believed that the blue man had promised him that life. He didn't want to fight for the Emperor. He didn't want to fight for the lion. He wanted his wheat field. He and a few dozen other survivors found a maintenance hatch that had been left open by a malfunctioning automaton. They entered the spire. They were the first unaugmented humans to breach the Conqueror's sanctum. They were not warriors. They were witnesses. They walked through halls of light and glass. They saw the captured Primarchs in their stasis tubes. They saw the maps of the galaxy being rewritten. They saw the cost of the perfect order. It was a world without flavor. It was a world where everything was a calculation. Grigory looked at the stasis tube of Sanguinius. The angel looked beautiful and sad. Grigory realized that the blue man was keeping the angel, not because he loved him, but because he was a rare specimen. The loader felt a surge of pure human rage. It was the rage of a man who had spent his life being a cog in a machine, only to find out the new machine was even colder. He took a heavy iron wrench from his belt. He didn't have a bolter or a power sword. He had a piece of junk. He smashed the control panel of the stasis tube. The alarm did not sound. The time field simply failed. Sanguinius did not wake up. His body was still dead. But the soul of the Primarch, which had been held in a temporal loop, was released. The psychic scream of the angel's departure hit the grid like a hammer. It was a scream of pure grief that echoed through every mind on Terra. The Chronopolis shook. The violet sky turned red. The blood of the martyrs, which had been cleaned away by the automatons, began to seep through the floors. The past was returning. The memories of the Imperium's 10,000 years of suffering were too heavy for the grid to hold. The weight of the dead was breaking the floor of the future. Kang felt the fracture. He looked at his console and saw the variables cascading into infinity. He saw the loader Grigory standing over the broken tube. Kang could have erased Grigory with a thought. He could have turned him into a pile of ash. But he hesitated. He was fascinated by the fact that a man so small could cause a failure so large. He realized that the human race was not a flaw in the timeline. It was the timeline. The suffering, the faith, and the madness were the only things that gave the seconds meaning. Without the chaos of the human soul, time was just a measurement of decay. Kang began to laugh. It was a sound of genuine amusement. He realized that he had been trying to win a game that had no rules. The strategic reversal occurred when the Chaos Gods, sensing the weakness of the grid, launched their final assault. The great Unmaker, which had been a storm in the warp, manifested on the surface of Terra. It was a black shadow that swallowed the sun. It began to dissolve the spire of the Chronopolis. The bronze automatons were corrupted instantly. Their bronze skins grew horns and eyes. Their logic circuits began to pray to the dark gods. The lion, seeing the corruption of the order he had joined, realized his mistake. He saw that Kang's peace was just a different kind of death. The lion turned his sword against the automatons. He began to hunt the machines he had led. He was a knight once more, but he was a knight without a king. Guilliman reached the gates of the palace at the head of 1,000,000 pilgrims. He saw the lion fighting in the ruins. He saw the black shadow of the Unmaker. He saw the blue spire falling. He did not order a charge. He ordered a prayer. He told the billions of people to focus their minds on the light of the Astronomicon. He wanted them to burn a hole through the grid with their faith. The psychic energy of the pilgrims was channeled through the remaining navigators. It hit the grid like a lance of white fire. The blue lines began to melt. The violet sky cracked. The light of the Emperor, which had been muffled for months, flared into a blinding brilliance. It was not a gentle light. It was the light of a dying sun. The convergence was at hand. Kang stood at the center of the collapsing spire. He saw the lion approaching from one side and the shadow of the Unmaker from the other. He saw the white fire of the pilgrim's faith burning away his work. He had one final choice. He could use his time engine to go back to the beginning and try again. He could erase this entire failure and start a new simulation. But he looked at the loader Grigory, who was still standing there holding his wrench. Grigory was bleeding. He was shaking, but he was still there. He was a fact that could not be edited. Kang decided to stay. He wanted to see how this version ended. He wanted to see the final outcome of the human experiment. He turned to his console and initiated the final convergence. He did not try to save the grid. He used the remaining power of the Chronopolis to lock the galaxy into a single inevitable moment. He brought the past, the present, and the future together into a single battlefield. The Horus Heresy, the Indomitus Crusade, and the end of time were now happening simultaneously on the plains of Terra. Horus Lupercal stood beside Abaddon. Sanguinius's ghost fought beside the living saints. The Necrons and the Tyranids and the Orcs were all drawn into the whirlpool of the present. It was a strategic catastrophe that redefined reality. There were no longer lines on a map. There was only the struggle. The human thread reached its lowest point as the atmosphere of Terra began to ignite. The oxygen was burning. The water was boiling. The millions of pilgrims were being consumed by the very light they had summoned. They died with the Emperor's name on their lips, but their death was not a sacrifice. It was a cost. The weathering of the planet was complete. Terra was no longer a world. It was a pyre. The deterioration of the imperial structure was absolute. The bureaucracy was gone. The High Lords were dead. Only the soldiers remained. The Space Marines of every chapter fought side by side with the remnants of the Guard and their sisters of battle. They were the last fragments of a broken mirror. The tactical situation was a blur of violence. A squad of Ultramarines found themselves fighting beside a group of World Eaters from 10,000 years ago. They did not speak. They did not question. They just killed the demons that were pouring out of the ground. The logic of faction and doctrine was gone. There was only the living and the unmaking. The Lion and Guilliman met in the middle of the carnage. They looked at each other. They did not argue about the past. They did not talk about Kang. They stood back to back and fought. They were the sons of the Emperor, and they were doing the only thing they were made for. They were holding the line against the end of everything. Kang watched them. He saw the beauty of their struggle. He saw that the Imperium's power was not in its guns or its ships, but in its refusal to stop dying. He realized that he could never conquer a people who viewed extinction as a daily ritual. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small device. It was the original seed of the grid. He looked at it for a moment, and then he crushed it. The blue light vanished. The violet sky was replaced by the red fire of the burning atmosphere. The grid was gone. The timeline was no longer straight, but it was no longer under his control. He was now just a man in a blue mask standing in the middle of a war he could not win. This ended with a revelation that redefined the prior assumptions of the conflict. The great Unmaker, the shadow of the Chaos Gods, was not trying to destroy Kang. It was trying to become him. The Chaos Gods realized that the only thing better than a galaxy of chaos was a galaxy of controlled suffering. They wanted the grid. They wanted the power to edit the timeline so they could feed on the same moments of pain forever. The enemy was not order. The enemy was the stagnation of the soul. It closed with the sound of the Golden Throne failing. The life support systems which had held the Emperor for 10,000 years finally ran out of power. The light of the Astronomicon went out. The galaxy was plunged into total darkness. In that darkness, the only thing that could be heard was the breathing of the billions of humans who were waiting for the end. The final convergence was complete. The offer was being made. The total darkness that swallowed the galaxy with the failure of the Golden Throne lasted for a subjective eternity. On Terra, the silence was heavier than the scream of the warp. The atmospheric fires flickered out, as if the air itself had lost the will to burn. Kang the Conqueror stood in the center of the ruins of his spire. He was no longer a god of the timeline. He was a survivor in a graveyard of his own making. The light of the Astronomicon was gone. The path through the warp was closed. The billion souls on the surface of the throne world were a silent tide of shadows. Then the ground began to tremble. It was not a geological shift. It was the vibration of a heartbeat. It was the sound of a father waking up in a house that was on fire. The Golden Throne had failed as a life support system, but it had succeeded as a cocoon. The death of the Emperor's physical body was the final strategic condition required for the release of his psychic essence. The light that returned to the sky was not the blue of the grid or the violet of the Chronopolis. It was a gold so bright it burned the retinas of every living thing in the sector. The strategic chain reaction began with the birth of the Star Child. This was not a gentle savior. It was the collective rage and sorrow of 10,000 years of human misery concentrated into a single point of psychic force. The gold light did not just push back the darkness. It annihilated it. The great Unmaker, the shadow of the four Chaos Gods, was struck by the first wave of the Emperor's ascent. The black sludge of the warp turned to steam. The demons that had been feasting on the ruins of the palace were vaporized. But this was not a victory for humanity. The Emperor in his ascended form was as cold and uncompromising as Kang. He was the god of a race that had been taught to hate. He did not look at the survivors with pity. He looked at them as fuel. The souls of the billions of pilgrims who had died at the gates were drawn into his light. They were consumed to provide the energy for his final war against the Conqueror. Kang watched the ascent with the clinical detachment of a historian. He saw the Emperor rise from the rubble of the sanctum. He was a being of shifting golden light, a giant of fire and iron. Kang realized that the Imperium had finally achieved the efficiency he had tried to impose upon them. They had become a single weapon directed by a single will. The strategic reversal was complete. The Conqueror, who wanted to bring order, was now the only advocate for the individual. If the Emperor won, there would be no more humans, only a hive mind of faith. If the Chaos Gods won, there would be only entropy. Kang looked at his hands. He still held the knowledge of the centuries. He still had the technology of the future. He made his final strategic choice. He would not fight for his dynasty. He would fight for the mess. He would fight for the right of the human race to be flawed, broken, and unpredictable. The conflict shifted to the mental plane of the warp, which was now being reshaped by the Emperor's presence. Kang used his chronal harness to project himself into the psychic storm. He met the Emperor in a place that was a memory of the ancient past. They stood on the plains of Central Asia on Terra, thousands of years before the first rocket left the atmosphere. The sky was blue, the grass was green. There was no smoke and no blood. The Emperor appeared as he had been at the start of his journey, a man of humble origin with eyes that held the weight of the future. He did not speak with words. He spoke with the pressure of a son. He told Kang that the timeline was a circle that ended with the death of the species. He said that the only way to save humanity was to transcend time. He wanted to turn every human soul into a static fragment of his own divinity. He wanted a galaxy of gold that would never change. Kang responded with the logic of a man who had seen the end of every civilization. He told the Emperor that a galaxy that never changes is a galaxy that is already dead. He showed the Emperor the museums of the Chronopolis. He showed him the species he had tried to save by putting them in glass cases. They had stopped growing. They had stopped dreaming. They had become decorations. Kang argued that the struggle of the 41st millennium, the filth, the hunger, and even the war were the only things that made the humans worth saving. He said that a man like the loader Grigory, who could find hope in a picture of a wheat field, was more powerful than a god who had no needs. The strategic argument was between the safety of the cage and the danger of the wilderness. While the two titans argued in the psychic void, the physical war on Terra reached its unavoidable convergence. The Lion and Guilliman were the only ones left who could lead. They saw the golden light of their father, and they felt the pull of his will. It was a command to surrender their individuality and join the collective light. For Guilliman the administrator, it was a tempting offer. It was the ultimate system. For the Lion, the hunter, it was an insult. He had spent his life in the dark so that others could live in the light. But he did not want to be the light. The two brothers stood together in the ruins of the Eternity Gate. They saw the remnants of their legions standing around them. There were no more colors. There were no more icons. There were only warriors waiting for the end. The Tyranid hive mind launched its final adaptation. The Chronovores had consumed enough of the blue grid to understand the nature of the Emperor's light. They began to vibrate at a frequency that cancelled out the golden radiance. They were the null zone of the universe. A wave of shadow monsters swept toward the palace. They did not eat flesh. They ate the psychic energy of the ascended Emperor. The golden light flickered. The souls that had been drawn into the Emperor's light were released in a violent burst of spiritual energy. This was the catastrophic escalation that changed the motives of every faction. The Chaos Gods, seeing that the Emperor could be eaten, joined their power with the Tyranids. The alliance of Hell and the Swarm was the final complication. It was a force of pure negation that wanted to delete the very concept of existence. Kang saw the shadow approaching. He realized that neither he nor the Emperor could win alone. The order of the Conqueror and the faith of the Emperor were both structures. The Tyranids and chaos were the absence of structure. Kang reached out to the Emperor's mind. He offered an unavoidable bargain. He would use the technology of the Chronopolis to anchor the Emperor's essence back into the material world. He would give the Emperor a body again, but it would be a body of bronze and glass, a machine god that could fight the shadow. In return, the Emperor had to give up his dream of a golden hive mind. He had to allow the timeline to remain broken. He had to allow the humans to be free of his control. It was the ultimate strategic sacrifice. The Emperor had to choose between being a god of a dead race or a guardian of a living one. The Emperor accepted. The convergence of ancient technology and divine psychic power created a new entity. The bronze automatons of Kang's army began to glow with the golden fire. They were no longer mindless machines. They were the hosts for the Emperor's shards. This was the legion of the damned made manifest in the shells of the future. The bronze army turned to face the shadow of the Tyranids and chaos. It was a battle of light and metal against darkness and teeth. The Lion and Guilliman led the charge. They were flanked by machines that fought with the memories of dead heroes. A bronze soldier would move with the skill of a captain from the Great Crusade. A glass drone would fire with the precision of a master sniper. The combined force of Kang's logic and the Emperor's will was a strategic masterstroke that the Chaos Gods could not calculate. The human cost of the final battle was the total destruction of Terra as a habitable world. The oceans boiled away. The crust cracked open to reveal the iron core. The billions of pilgrims were caught in the crossfire of gods. They died by the millions every second. This was the final weathering of the human thread. The people were the collateral damage of a war they did not understand. But in the middle of the fire, the loader Grigory was still alive. He had found shelter in a reinforced bunker deep beneath the palace. He was not alone. There were hundreds of others, clerks, soldiers, and laborers. They were the seeds of the future. They sat in the dark and they shared their last rations. They did not pray to the Emperor. They did not look at the blue masks. They looked at each other. They were the humanity that Kang had decided to protect. The strategic depth of the conflict reached its final point when Kang activated the Tesseract Labyrinth on a galactic scale. He did not use it to trap his enemies. He used it to isolate the Sol system from the rest of reality. He created a bubble of time where the war could be finished, without destroying the rest of the galaxy. This was a doctrinal overreaction that cost Kang his connection to his other selves. By creating the bubble, he was cutting himself off from the Council of Kangs. He was becoming a singular entity, a version of himself that could never return to his own time. He was committing chronological suicide to save a single moment in history. He did it because he had grown to respect the defiance of the Imperium. He wanted to see how the story ended without his interference. The battle against the Shadow lasted for 100 years within the bubble, though only a second passed outside. The Bronze Legion of the Emperor fought a war of attrition against the Infinite Swarm. The Lion was the first of the Primarchs to fall. He died at the gates of the palace, his sword broken in the neck of a Tyranid Hive tyrant that was the size of a mountain. He died with a smile on his face, because he was finally a secret that could not be told. Guilliman survived, but he was a ghost of a man. His mind was shattered by the tactical complexity of a century-long siege. He sat on a throne of rubble and directed the final defense with a voice that was a mechanical rasp. The deterioration of the heroes was a testament to the personal cost of the struggle. Das es kein Benedictus, in the final year of the century, the Shadow was pushed back. The great Unmaker was broken into 4 pieces and cast back into the warp. The Tyranid swarm was starved of psychic energy and withered into dust. The golden light of the Emperor faded, leaving the bronze automatons as silent monuments in the desert of Terra. The war was over. The bubble dissolved. The Sol system returned to the galaxy. But it was a different galaxy. The warp was no longer a storm. It was a calm, dark sea. The blue grid was gone, but the lines of time were straight. The influence of Kang had left a permanent mark on the physics of the universe. The magic of the 41st millennium was replaced by the cold laws of the future. Kang stood on the surface of the dead Terra. He was old now. His chronal harness was sparking and broken. He looked at the horizon and saw the sun rising over the ruins. He was alone. The Emperor's essence had retreated into the machines, becoming a silent watcher. The Primarchs were gone. The High Lords were gone. Kang saw a hatch open in the ground. Grigory walked out. The loader was an old man now. He had lived his entire life in the bunker. He looked at the sky and he saw the stars. He looked at the man in the blue mask. He did not bow. He did not scream. He walked up to Kang and handed him a small, withered piece of paper. It was the picture of the wheat field. It was yellowed and torn, but the image was still visible. Grigory told Kang that the children in the bunker had drawn a new version of the picture. They had drawn a field of bronze wheat under a golden sun. This was the small choice that led to the final outcome. Kang took the picture, and he realized that he had not conquered the timeline. He had been conquered by it. He had arrived as an editor, and he was leaving as a character in someone else's story. He felt a sense of peace that he had never known in all his travels through the centuries. He realized that the goal of a conqueror is not to win, but to be remembered. And the humans would remember the man who had given them a chance to survive the end of the world. He tapped a button on his wrist. It was the last of his power. He did not use it to travel to the future. He used it to transform the surface of Terra. He did not make it a grid. He did not make it a cathedral. He turned the dust of the billions who had died into fertile soil. He turned the ruins of the palace into a forest. He gave the survivors a world they could farm. The strategic progression of the campaign ended with the dissolution of the Imperium. Without the Emperor on the throne and without the light of the Astronomicon, the million worlds of the human race were on their own. The central authority of Terra was gone. The bureaucracy was dead. The galaxy became a collection of thousands of independent human systems. Some would fall to Xenos. Some would turn to chaos. But many would thrive. They would build their own ships and write their own laws. They would innovate because they had to. They would become the humans of the dark age of technology once again, but with the memory of the fall to guide them. The loss of the Imperium was the gain of the species. This was the measurable cost of the victory. The age of the God Emperor was over. The age of the man had begun again. Kang walked into the forest he had created. He felt his body beginning to fade. He was a temporal anomaly that was being corrected by the universe. He was a ghost of a timeline that no longer existed. He sat down under a tree that looked like an oak from ancient Earth. He watched the survivors of the bunker as they began to clear the land. They were building huts. They were making tools. They were arguing about who would lead. It was messy. It was inefficient. It was beautiful. Kang closed his eyes. He thought about the Council of Kangs. He thought about the empires he had built in 1,000 other universes. None of them mattered as much as this single forest on a dead world. He had finally found a moment that was worth staying in. The strategic condition of the galaxy was now a blank slate. The Necrons were still in their tombs, but they were without their leaders. The orcs were scattered. The Tyranids were rebooting their hive mind. The Chaos Gods were starving and weak. The board was empty. The players were new. The actions of the Conqueror had cleared the way for a new history to be written. The motives of the factions had been changed from conquest to survival. The consequences would echo forward for millions of years. It was a revelation that redefined everything. The end of the world was not a catastrophe. It was a release. The final convergence had led to a beginning. The human thread of the story concluded with the death of the loader Grigory. He died in his sleep a few years after the war ended. He was buried in the soil of Terra, near the forest where Kang had vanished. His children and grandchildren continued his work. They did not know the name of the man in the blue mask. They called him the Blue Ghost. They did not worship him. They just thanked him for the rain. The fatigue of the long war was replaced by the healthy tiredness of the harvest. The rations were gone, replaced by the bread they grew with their own hands. The weathering of the soul was healed by the rhythm of the seasons. The personal cost had been paid in full. It closed with the image of a single bronze automaton, standing on a cliff overlooking the new settlements. Inside the machine was a spark of golden light. It did not move. It did not speak. It just watched. It was the guardian of the new world. It was the memory of the emperor stripped of his ego and his empire. It was a witness to the fact that the humans were finally doing what they were meant to do. They were living. The silence of the galaxy was no longer the silence of the grave. It was the silence of a house where everyone is finally asleep. The chronicle of the Conqueror was complete. The timeline was no longer his. It belonged to the people who were brave enough to live it 1 second at a time. The record of the rediscovered campaign archive was sealed. The story of the what if was now the history of what is. Kang's final strategic legacy was the preservation of potential. He had prevented the absolute victory of any one side. He had broken the stalemate of the 41st millennium and replaced it with the uncertainty of the 42nd. In the scholarly consistency of the record, it was noted that the transition from a theological empire to a fractured biological diaspora was the most significant event in human history since the birth of the species. The victory of the human spirit had cost the death of the human god. The defeat of the Conqueror had cost the loss of his immortality. Both sides had lost everything to give the galaxy a chance to start over. It was a strategic trade that only a veteran of 1,000 timelines would have the courage to make. The light of the gold and the blue faded into the darkness of the stars, leaving only the quiet sound of the wind in the trees. The war was over. The future was open. The clock was ticking, and for the first time in 10,000 years, no one was holding the key. The final entry in the recovered archive of the Hydrofer campaign is not a military report or a tactical summary, but a fragment of a planetary log from the world now designated as Terra Nova. The scribe who recorded these words did not know the grand scale of the conflict that had ended his world. He only knew that the sky was quiet. The records of the administratum have been replaced by the oral traditions of the village elders. They speak of a time when the stars were a source of terror, and the ground was a place of sacrifice. Now the stars are merely lights in the distance. The warp has receded into a dormant state of low entropy. The great rift that once tore the galaxy in half has stabilized into a series of predictable nebula. This is the strategic reality of the post-Kang era. The galaxy is no longer a single battlefield governed by the iron laws of a dying empire. It is a vast and silent ocean where thousands of islands of humanity are beginning to build their own boats. The death of the Astronomicon did not end travel. It merely made it a local concern. Ships now move between nearby systems using the same physics that Kang once used to conquer time. The technology of the future has been salvaged by the necessity of the present. In the ruins of the old palace, on what was once the throne world, the trees have grown tall over the shattered adamantium. The bronze automatons remain where they fell, or where they stood, at the end of the 100-year siege. They have become part of the landscape. Moss grows over their glass eyes. Birds build nests in the hollows of their chests. Sometimes the golden light within them flickers, but it is no longer a command. It is a memory. The Emperor is no longer a master of mankind, but a silent partner in their survival. He is the quiet hum in the machine and the strength in the arm of the farmer. He has achieved the peace he could never find while he sat on the throne. The strategic cost was the loss of his divinity, but the gain was the restoration of his humanity. The legend of the Blue Ghost is told in the evenings. The children are taught that once a man came from the future to show them that the present was worth fighting for. They are taught that he was not a friend or a foe, but a teacher who used a hard lesson. The Necron Dynasties have retreated into a deep hibernation once again. Without the central command of the Sautake, and without the guidance of the Silent King who vanished during the final convergence, the mechanical legions have returned to their deterministic programming. They wait for a signal that will never come. The Tyranid hive mind has redirected its tendrils toward other galaxies, seeking easier biomass that does not fight back with the weapons of time. The Chaos Gods remain in the warp, but they are like predators in a cage. The grid may be gone, but the laws of the universe are now too rigid for them to manifest with their former ease. The galaxy has become a place of prose rather than poetry. It is a place of cause and effect. The scholarly conclusion of this history is that the intervention of Kang the Conqueror saved the human species by destroying the institution that claimed to protect it. The Imperium had to fall so that humanity could stand. The loader Grigory is a name lost to all but this specific record. His wrench and his picture of the wheat field have long since turned to dust. But the legacy of his defiance remains in the way the new settlements are built. They are not built for the glory of a god. They are built for the comfort of the family. The fatigue of the species has finally broken. The long nightmare of the 41st millennium is a ghost story used to frighten children into staying close to the hearth. The deterioration of the old world is complete, and the new world is robust and young. The personal cost was a galaxy of blood, but the outcome is a galaxy of potential. This archive is now sealed. It serves as a reminder that history is not a straight line, but a circle that can be broken by the will of a single person. The time of the conqueror is over. The time of the man has begun. The clocks on Terra Nova are synchronized with the rising of the sun. They tick with a steady and human rhythm. 1 second, 1 minute, 1 hour. The future is no longer a plan. It is a surprise.